This is a massive case, so sorry if I fail to do it justice. I am positive that I likely missed some information while writing this, and some sources have contradictory information due to how massive this case was. It is going to be similar to my Juliana Campovid write-up. I'm going to miss some things because after all there is practically continuous updates from his arrest in January 2019 to his sentencing in November 2021. I just hope it's nothing too important. Also, some information here isn't in the sources because it's only minor pieces of info such as his exact birthplace, and I don't feel like sharing the same article but with just one extra piece as long as it's not too important. Since Google Translate was used, I also may have gotten some things wrong or confused. Gilad Saroussy Pereg was born on April 16, 1981. In Petah Tikva, Israel. Gilad preferred not to use his father's name as their relationship was severely strained as his father walked out on and abandoned Gilad alongside his mother Piria Saroussy and 4 siblings. Gilad, however, was very close with his grandfather, whom he came to view as his father figure, and so when he passed away in 2006, the 25-year-old Gilad's behavior began to change and he would be afflicted with a psychological disorder that was not fully diagnosed. Processing IMG RAS 06P64 trademark 091. Gilad was described as an intelligent man before his grandfather died, having graduated from high school at 16, and by the time he was 24 he was an electronic engineer at the Technion, the Israeli Institute of Technology. But as mentioned, soon after his grandfather passed away his life began to go downhill, with garbage piling up at his residence, and was reported numerous times for harassment and indecent behavior, with him causing great annoyance amongst the female students and running around the campus naked. His academic studies would begin to suffer and his gambling debts would begin to pile up. Eventually, his family and the Israeli police decided that the time had come to institutionalize Gilad and give him the help he needed, as Israeli police reports indicated that he had suffered from paranoia and schizophrenia, as well as having committed numerous crimes such as harassment, indecent behavior in public, destruction of property, violating court orders and obstructing the police. But when he learnt of this, he wasted no time in trying to avoid such as fate and fled the country, arriving at his new home in Mendoza, Argentina on December 15, 2007. Gilad would later claim to authorities that he left Israel not because his family were about to admit him to a psychiatric hospital, but rather because the nation itself has betrayed, deceived him, and that they took his service at the front lines for granted. There are, however, no official records of Gilad having been involved in the military, and according to a relative, when the Israeli SDF came for Gilad's mandatory conscription, they deemed him unfit for service despite a myriad of articles describing him as a former soldier. When he arrived in Argentina, his neighbors described his looks as that of a European model, but he still acted strangely as he wore the same outfit every day, and when he would walk he crossed the sidewalk to the side that faces the cemetery rather than the one that faces the houses. He also approached his neighbors once to ask if it bothered any of them that he installed a CCTV camera for him to watch the street. Gilad would open up a deli and told his neighbors and anybody that asked that he was from Norway, and that his name was Flodder Relti, and provided fake passports and documentation to prove it. Gilad lived in a small dwelling that he had constructed himself, and soon his appearance would deteriorate as he stopped taking care of himself and would barely even eat, preferring to only consume vitamin compounds instead of food. His neighbors would soon describe him as a strange and lonely man who kept mostly to himself and had a foul odor to him. Other less charitable descriptions were given to him by his neighbors who said that he had above-average intelligence with an IQ of 180 and described him as a con artist and compulsive liar. Later on, he would drop the Flodder Relti alias and instead legally change his name to Nicolash Gil Pereg. Nicolash likewise didn't think highly of his neighbors accusing him of theft and drug trafficking. On numerous occasions, processing IMGQ8QR-IQ0BTM091. Nicolash in 2018 would file a lawsuit against an architect whom he had commissioned to build a soccer and tennis court on his property back in 2010, claiming that he had been defrauded and that the situation led to immense emotional and psychological distress, with Nicolash soon getting addicted to medication due to the situation. He sought 1,947,000 Argentine pesos in compensation. In October 2018 he suddenly ended the lawsuit. He also had 20 businesses registered in the name of him or his mother which he used to write bad checks and would soon be facing lawsuits over unpaid taxes on his own property. Nicolas's property was valued at 270,000 Argentine pesos and located in front of the Guaymallén cemetery. Nicolas's property would be raided on numerous occasions due to suspicions of arms trafficking and possession of restricted firearms, with these raids shining a light on Nicolas's living conditions. Despite all of his money, he willingly subjected himself to the following conditions. The dwelling he lived in had no basic services such as water or electricity and was very unkempt, with filth everywhere. The police during the various visits to his property seized $25,000, 15,000 euros, 3,000 Argentine pesos and an undisclosed number of Israeli shekels, but since he was unemployed, it's unknown where this money came from. He also had 40 firearms registered in his name, but very few were found at his house, and Nicolash never made any visits to a firing range to practice his shooting. Despite the money he had made from his likely illegal activities and the deli he owned, he lived on the brink of destitution and was 9 million pesos in debt. The police never found any toilet in his house, and instead whenever Nicolash needed to urinate or defecate he opted to do so on the same floor the mattress he slept on rested upon. He also had an abundance of pornographic magazines and DVDs in his possession. As he had no bathroom, whenever he wanted to wash his face he would trespass onto the nearby cemetery and use one of their faucets. Processing IMG 5 horsepower 5R0WPPM091. Processing IMG R21 QVXQPM091. Processing IMG RCOC 24 UTPM091. Only bits and pieces are known about Nicolas's life in Argentina, but he would purchase more firearms and the highest amount of ammunition he legally could, and in 2018 he would write 46 bad checks, which is where his 9 million peso debt came from, and would attempt to file a police report over the alleged theft of 11 of his firearms. The only legitimate money he seemed to have made was money that his mother would wire to him as she worked for a collections agency back in Israel. On January 11, 2019, Nicolas's mother Pyria Saroussy and aunt Lily Pereg would finally travel to Argentina themselves as tourists and to see Nicolash, with the two having made trips to Argentina since January 2011, but this time the purpose of the visit was to resolve Nicolas's debt issues. Pyria, as mentioned, worked for a collections agency while Lily was a university professor and had both Israeli and Australian citizenship. Processing IMG LMB4I1HKIM091. Not a whole lot seems to be known about their meeting with Nikolash, but he did finally shave for the occasion and appeared much more presentable. The two sisters rented an apartment to stay at during their stay. Their relatives in Israel grew concerned when they had not heard back from them in a while, and soon Nikolash would report the two missing, stating that when he last saw the two they visited him at his home, and he later escorted him to a bus back to their apartment. With pressure being asserted upon him by the Israeli and Australian governments, the Argentine authorities launched an extensive search operation to find the two sisters. The police checked their apartment and found all of their luggage in place and untouched, meaning that if they had left their apartment they didn't intend to be out for very long. The police, however, did not believe they even made it back. They had deemed the disappearance suspicious and already were suspicious of Nikolash. Part of why they doubted his story was because CCTV cameras from a nearby cemetery next to where Nikolash lived showed them walking in the area, but they never showed them leaving. The search for the two sisters would then be focused entirely around Nicholas's property, something which upset him greatly, with his speaking to the media and accusing his neighbors of being behind the disappearances and stating that he lived in fear of leaving his home. "I have been robbed 50 times. They are Bolivians who make a mess here in the whole area and the police do nothing. I can't leave my house because if I go out they rob me," is a quote he gave to journalists, pointing towards his neighbors as he uttered it. He also explained his large abundance of firearms by saying that his neighbors would have killed him if he didn't have them for protection. He then said, "Someone who may have come from Israel went after them to hurt them. Or it may be someone who hates me here in the province. Hurt him to take revenge on me." The police's visit to Nicholas's house over this matter revealed that not much had changed compared to their last visits, and that his property was still very much in a state of disarray. Only this time he had taken in a number of animals, having 37 pets on his property, 4 of them dogs and 33 of them cats, and he likely had much more, as the police during their search of his property found the bones of numerous cats buried beneath his land. He also stockpiled on cat food and veterinary medicine, and his floor was stained with not only his own urine and feces but also that of his animals. They also found no food meant for human consumption in his home, indicating that he probably ate the cat food. Processing IMG-C9MFPUAFN091. Processing IMG-IJNSUWFCFN091. Processing IMG-ZIQ3m9EDFN091. Processing IMG-YATA2GFFN091. Processing IMG-D8J6SVLGFN091. Processing IMG-UFWWJ4P2GN091. Processing IMG-9BIVU1WGN091. Eventually, on January 18, police dogs were utilized in an attempt to find the sisters, and when they indicated human remains on Nicholas's property, he was arrested while search efforts intensified, and on January 26 the bodies of Pyria Saroussy and Lily Pereg would be discovered in a well under a pile of stones. The police then conducted a full forensic examination of Nicholas's home, where they discovered 3 of the firearms he had reported stolen, and also a T-shirt, bag of cement and cigarette butts stained with blood, from which DNA could be extracted and compared to a toothbrush at the two sisters' apartment, which ended up being a match, but it was unknown who owned the toothbrush, so it wasn't conclusive enough evidence. Police also interviewed a bus driver who recognized Nikolash and the sisters and testified that they were loudly arguing with one another in a foreign language, likely Hebrew. Nikolash was charged with 2 counts of murder, and when he heard the charges he said, "If you don't let me go home to take care of my cats, you're going to find a body," and threatened to take his own life, leading him to be isolated from the other inmates. He showed no signs of regret or sorrow over the news that the 2 were killed. Meanwhile, the bodies of the 2 were examined, and it was determined that Lily had been shot 3 times with a revolver, while Pyria had been beaten to death with signs of a struggle and strangled with a lasso. They had also suffered post-mortem injuries, with both bodies being pierced with irons in various parts of their body. Police also found that Nikolash had booked a flight to Italy, but he also had tickets booked in the name of 4 of his cats. This flight was however cancelled after he reported the sisters as missing. The prosecution argued that the murders were premeditated and that the motive was likely monetary in nature due to Nicholas's extensive debts. Processing IMGONVVRBGSNN091. As mentioned, Nikolash was isolated and placed on suicide watch, while numerous psychologists would visit and attempt to speak with them. Not long after, Nikolash went on a 4-day hunger strike and refused to eat any food. The police meanwhile continued their investigation and learned that not long before the sisters arrived, Nikolash in his disheveled state visited a gun store asking for a firearm after the police had confiscated his, with his reasoning being that he wanted it in case thieves broke into his home. It was during his time in isolation that Nicholas's behavior and mental state began to severely deteriorate, and his strange habits and behavior made themselves known. He demanded that 10 of his cats be brought to his cell and that he be allowed to see his mother's body. These requests were denied, as the bodies had already been sent back to Israel, and it was stated that the cats would be a hygiene hazard, but things would only get worse. At the funeral service in Israel, relatives of the sisters stated that they did not hate Nikolash, stating that hatred would be unhealthy and not do them any good, and reiterated their belief that Nikolash was mentally unwell. The Argentine prosecutor, however, thought differently and deemed him of sound mind, and he was brought before a judge on February 19. The judge stated that Nikolash would behave very strangely and overreact to the simplest of questions. He stated that he didn't remember when he was born, identified himself as Flodder Relti, and referred to his 37 cats as his children. The first psychiatric report stated that he was a hostile, evasive, defiant, ironic and confrontational person, that he hides and manipulates information for profit, while the only effective bond is with his pets, but also believed that he was lucid and understood the legal ramifications of his actions. The prosecution and Nicholas's family requested he be held in pre-trial detention, but the defense argued he be released but put on house arrest until trial, stating that he wasn't a flight risk due to his relationship with his cats and that he wasn't safe in prison due to the other inmates expressing their desire to kill him. The court hearings were postponed after Nikolash urinated himself, prompting the judge to have him removed. Before his removal, Nikolash had this to say: "I don't care if I'm in jail or under house arrest, all I want is to be with my cats. If you want to send me home with 50 police officers to guard me, go ahead. I'm not interested in running away. I'm only interested in my cats." Nikolash was eventually kept in pre-trial detention with him at the hearing that reached the decision. having to be removed as he kept making a non-stop, meowing noise. He was isolated from the other inmates and wasn't there long before put back on suicide watch for threatening to take his own life if his cats were not delivered to his cell. Nicholas would also refuse to eat any food or drink any water but would accept milk and requested that he be given cat food or food meant for animals. He refused to shower or bathe. He would often take off his prison clothes and never used the toilet and would just urinate and defecate on his cell's floor and would not be dissuaded from such behavior during the few times in which he was in contact with other inmates, with him on one such occasion defecating on the floor in front of a table where two other inmates were eating lunch. Nicholas, just as the defense had feared, would also be attacked as another protective custody inmate stabbed him. Although the injuries were not life-threatening, on another occasion a group of inmates tried to break into his sector of the prison before riot control put down the lynch mob. Soon the public would be able to witness Nicholas's actions in prison as a video was uploaded showing a naked Nicholas hissing, meowing and growling while attempting to claw at the guards once they opened their cell door. This video is available to watch on YouTube, titled, Ashishe Comporta Gil Pereg en la Cárcel. The purpose and context behind this video were the guards attempting to transfer him for a mental health evaluation. The next court hearing happened on March 13 and Nicholas said this to the judge, "You may think I'm crazy. But I'm not. I see myself as a person, but I'm a cat. I have 37 children and I need to know how they are." He further requested that he be transferred from the prison and into a zoo. The judge at this hearing would end this hearing by ordering that Nicholas undergo a second psychiatric evaluation, and on March 29 he was transferred to a psychiatric hospital, with this decision being in part motivated by Nicholas suddenly stripping naked in the middle of the hearing. Later, the issue of whether he can see his cats were finally put to rest once they were sent to an animal welfare organization and put up for adoption. More updates would come in September when Nicholas threatened to kill himself in response to prison officials forcing him to bathe, with him stating that he'd purposefully avoid eating and to just let himself die. It was further alleged that during this forced bathing the guards handcuffed and beat him. In October, his mental health would become the focal point yet again when the National Assistance Program for Persons with Disabilities in their relations with the administration of justice visited the prison and later made a report stating, the inmate would not be receiving the necessary sanitary conditions in accordance with his procedure in the prison complex where he is detained. They then recommended that he be transferred to a psychiatric hospital. A psychologist was one of those who conducted the report and interviewed Nicholas on September 19. This new psychologist disagreed and expressed their belief that he was insane. The next court hearing was on February 12, 2020, and Nicholas had to be expelled from the court due to continuous meowing. His defense continued to argue that he was mentally incompetent, citing a previous history of mental illness in Israel and the NPPDRAJ report from September, while the prosecution argued against this, citing the psychologist in Argentina who deemed him sane and how he didn't display any of this behavior before his arrest. The judge at this hearing ruled that he has a personality disorder, but it is not proven that he is delusional. Nicholas during this hearing had the long thick beard he had before the murders and wore the same white shirt he wore during his first hearing, which had now been stained brown. The case was continued to an unknown date later in 2020. His trial never occurred in 2020 due to COVID-19. However, he was admitted to a mental hospital for Another evaluation in May started and the staff at the hospital claimed that he responded well to treatment. The trial date was set for October 26, 2021. And it was going to be broadcasted live not just in Argentina but also in Israel and Australia, among other countries, with the audio being dubbed from Spanish into Hebrew and English respectively. While in the hospital he would refuse to shave, bathe or change his clothes and started losing muscle mass. During his first days in the hospital, the only things he would consume for the first days of incarceration were 8 liters of milk. October 26 came and the trial would finally begin, and it got off to a sensational start as numerous people watched as Nicholas live on camera would make a continuous meowing before being removed from the courtroom after refusing to stop or answer the judge and prosecutor's questions. When the judge asked, "Mr. Gil Pereg, is this your name?" he simply went, "Meow." The judge then said, "Before entering I warned you to be quiet and decorous. Otherwise you will have to be removed to an adjoining room." Nicholas again went, "Meow." This clip is available to watch on YouTube. Various witnesses would be called, including a father and son that owned a mechanical workshop, with the two stating that they heard the sounds of gunfire and 2 women screaming. His neighbors were also called to testify, and they explained that they never observed him acting as if he was a cat prior to the murders. The owners of various gun and firearm stores were also questioned and stated that whenever he went to purchase weapons from them, they stated that although he did act strangely, appear rather unkempt and paid only in cash with money held in a nylon bag, they testified that he never came off as insane to them. The next people called to the stand were the psychiatrist who examined them, with one saying, his ways of living were not compatible with those of the rest of the population in his pavilion, and this put him at risk. He wrote symbols with his own excrement on the walls and did not clean himself. Another stated, in principle, "I remember that he was diagnosed with a schizotypal personality disorder, a way of being that makes him a person isolated from the natural environment, with differential characteristics, extravagance and difficulties in social exchange." Another called by the prosecution said he was vigilant, lucid and able to communicate, before adding, "We did not detect alterations at the level of thought, nor delusions or hallucinations." The last one stated, "We evaluated him with a team of professionals, with interviews that lasted from 2 to 4 hours. Because he detailed and recounted a lot from the first day, no alterations in his judgment were observed or detected that would prevent him from distinguishing good from bad or directing his actions." The defense, however, countered this by producing his mental history in Israel, where he was known to have a long history of mental illness, and even called another psychiatrist from Argentina who disputed the findings of those called by the prosecution, who diagnosed Nicholas with paraphrenia and stated that, "He feels that he is a cat. He has a delusion and a thought disorder that on certain occasions he clearly uses to exaggerate or accentuate it in exchange for a benefit. It is a pathology in which critical judgment is altered. But in others, it remains preserved." Nicholas was later permitted to speak at the trial, where he denied killing anyone and said that his mother was still alive and visited him every night, with him saying the following: "When they arrested me, they supposedly found the bodies. In the raids they found nothing. They have kidnapped my mother and my aunt. My mother sees me every night and talks to me. She tells me that she is kidnapped and asks me to go save her." Nicholas would also explain his background, stating, "For a limited time I can be like a 2-legged creature and be like humans. But in my house, I lived 100% like a cat. When I put the mask on my face and act like a person. It was very difficult for me. It could be like this for 5 or 6 hours. I have lived in a closed bubble. After I opened my eyes at the university, I went to the army. I saw how bad they do it and I couldn't stand it. I spent 8 months locked up in the room of the house until I decided to become a cat. I was walking naked on the street and marking territory. I lost control of my body, so I talked to my mother and decided to escape. He explained that when he arrived in Argentina, he had a group of two-legged creatures who helped him because he was alone. And ended his statement by stating how he didn't desire to live in this world. I'm paranoid. I can't accept this world because it's so ugly. I don't want to know anything. On November 3, after 2 hours of deliberation, a jury unanimously found Nicolás capable of understanding the criminality of his actions and reached a guilty verdict. He was soon after sentenced to life imprisonment with release to be considered after 35 years. Despite the sentence, however, Nicolás is not currently in prison and instead resides in a mental hospital, as he has not been deemed safe or competent to be sent to prison yet due to his behaviors. The last update was on May 8, 2022, which describes his life at the hospital. Due to his continued refusal to bathe, he had developed thrombosis, phlebitis and a severe lice infection. His lawyer described him as almost like a vegetable all day. Nicolás as of late hasn't been meowing, but he still displays other cat-like behaviors such as refusing to bathe and sleeping in a ball. He has been described as fairly docile and heavily medicated and sedated at times. His attorneys intend on appealing the verdict and have Nicolás declared criminally insane. Sources Other North and South American crimes